Well, in Britain, it's become pretty much the number one issue because it's just so prevalent. I mean, we're getting the sort of levels of immigration that America gets, and we're like a fifth of the size. And so it's just really noticeable that things have changed and not for the better. I do totally agree with you about the point of not shying away from the conversation, though. That's the worst thing I think you can do is to say, well, this is off limits, because then you do get people with a particular agenda who can't recognize, they just collapse any detail of the conversation down.
Exactly.
And it doesn't help anyone, because there are manifest unfairnesses that have taken place that are being shouldered on the native people of Britain. But if your solution is something very terrible and extreme, they can't be addressed. Yeah. And that stigmatizes the entire realm of what is otherwise just political action. I think it's a consequence of many different layers. So first, I think you've got a political class who are invested in multiple ways in making sure that things carry on. Because, of course, this is what created them, because this is a problem that we've had going on for 25 years now, if not longer. And so the people in charge are a product of this system. And so they think, well, if things change, then I lose what I have. And it's like, okay, well, things are changing and they're degrading, which is probably going to mean you're going to end up losing what you have anyway, to someone who's a lot more hardline and is not going to take this. And that leads us to places we don't want to go to. But they think, well, if I change things, there was a famous question time quote from one of the audience members who's like, well, who's going to sell our coffee in Pret? So, right.
I think I remember that.
Yeah, that really summarizes the issue. The answer to that should be teenagers.
Yeah.
Right? The answer to that should be summer jobs or part-time jobs for kids who are getting through college or university and making their way through life. Like I did when I was young. I had rubbish part-time jobs or summer jobs doing things like that. But they view that to be the domain of some immigrant now. Yeah. It's like, okay, that's a really weird thing, right? And so they've got a kind of luxury that the people in charge are accustomed to, and they're worried about losing that. They're worried about losing political power. But also, I think there's a question of liberal philosophy that underpins all of this, that has essentially removed their ability to speak on behalf of the majority population. I don't know whether you've noticed, and I'm sure you have, but our politics across the West is just dominated by minoritarian concerns.
Yes.
It's what's the most important minority today.
Yes. Even gays, if the minority is under 1% of the population.
In fact, that makes them more privileged, right? That makes them more important to talk about. We need to talk about the trans question. It's like, do we though? I actually don't see many people struggling with that. Yeah, exactly. I see many people struggling with their grocery bills. I see many people worried about the cost of electricity and things like that because, whatever. The point being though, the majority population concern is never represented. And I think that's due to this kind of overemphasis on liberal ideology, where they have a way of constructing the world that frankly isn't true and leads us to strange and undesirable places. And if we try to step out of that, that is instantly stigmatized as being quote unquote far right.
Yeah.
I don't know what far right is even supposed to mean. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this as well, and it seems the term far right, they don't mean fascist or Nazi, because if they meant fascist or Nazi, they'd just call you it. They're not shy about calling you names, sure. And I'm sure you've been called a Nazi more than enough times, right? Haven't we all?
Yeah.
But when they call you far right, I always find this really interesting because that's a relative point, right? Being a fascist or a Nazi or a communist, these are absolute points. These are absolute ideologies. They've got a construction that happens in the abstract and so is essentially eternal. You always, in every time and every place, know what the opinions of a fascist, a Nazi, or a communist are, or a liberal, really, they should be. But when they say far right, they can never define what the precepts of being far right are. And so I think what they use far right to mean is the kind of pre-political social awareness of a native population group. So you'll see the Irish patriots now are being called far right. It's like, okay, but the English patriots were also far right. So are the Irish and the English patriots the same? Are they all on the same team? I mean, not normally the Irish and the English aren't considered to be on the same team. And then you've got the far right in France, who definitely aren't on the same team as the English or as, okay, and now the Germans have got a far right. And so what I think this means is just the the tribe that underpins the nation, as in every European country, and every old world country is based on tribal loyalty, a tribal understanding, what we would in previous times call a people, as in the English people, the Irish people, the Scottish people. Well, their representation, their political interests, that's, I think, what the far right is. And this is very human. This is a very sort of pre-theoretical understanding of what it is to live. And so you get just regular people who are just, well, things have changed. I don't like what's happened. But when you talk to these people, they're not going to give you a lecture on political philosophy.
Yes.
They don't know anything about theory. They belong to a group and they feel a kinship, and they're attuned to their own social group. And this is based on an area, and it's built out into the nation state itself. And they're concerned about that being eroded. And they're not concerned about an abstract political ideal that's trying to manifest itself into reality. And so those people, the regular people who are just not really political until it affects them, they're the far right, I think. And it's fear of this non-rational political position that I think prevents any kind of actual movement in the direction of improving things. Because the liberal position is rationalistic, it's theorized into existence, and the theory it's built on is actually just wrong. It has a wrong conception of humanity, because the liberals believed that liberalism begins at a thought experiment where they say, well, look, what was man like before he was in society? And they've got answers to this, but any normal person will be like, well, there's never been a time when man has not been in society. Even chimpanzees are in societies. Like, chimps aren't just wandering in the woods on their own. Like monkeys are, before human beings were in existence, we can go back and go through the archaeological record and find, like Homo habilis and like, what was it? Lucy. I can't remember the names of the scientific names of these things, but like they even then, they're not on their own. They're in groups. And so, Homo sapiens has always been a social animal, but the liberal thought experiment begins with him being an individual wandering around in the woods. It's like, okay, what are the rights of an individual on their own? And these are human rights. These are the abstract liberal rights that categorizes itself as having. And then it perceives that they must have come together to form a civilization at some point. And from the forming of this civilization then becomes institutes of government. Now, this isn't correct, but you can see why they would think this, say 300 years ago, under the alternate theory of absolute monarchy, as in God put the king in charge, and therefore you have no rights before the king, and therefore you're going to essentially be at the king's pleasure, or the king's arbitrary will forever. And you can see why that would have been appealing, a different theory of how society came together and became what it is, that justified actually resisting the absolute power of a king.
Yes.
This is the paradigm that we're still living in now. And so the liberal paradigm renders each individual person as being totally interchangeable. Right? It comes to the original human. What does an individual on their own? Well, when shorn of all of society's characteristics, you realize that you could hypothesize what a pre-social man would look like. He wouldn't have a language. He wouldn't have customs. He wouldn't have an education. He wouldn't have anything really other than what it is that all human beings would share. But actually, when you think about it, well, that's not very much, actually. Okay, he sleeps, he eats, he breeds, he does
basic animal stuff.
Yeah, basic animal things. But everything else is a product of him living in civilization. The way you think, the kind of things you do, the morality that you have, all of these things are actually not universal. They're really particular, and actually they're not interchangeable. And so the liberal theory breaks down really, really quickly when you actually try and apply it to any individual person who lives in the world. Because no one's a product of this abstract train of thought. And so I think this explains why our political class, who are deeply liberal, think, well, we'll just bring in 5,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 or 1 million new people to do the work that these British people aren't doing, because they're just all people. It's like, okay, in a way, yes, they're all just people, but in another way, no, there's massive differences. And then you see these conflicts between the natives and the new people, or between the different groups of new people who bring with them their cultural baggage and can't get rid of it. And that's another thing. These things are they are literally embedded into you in the way that you're born and raised. You don't even think about how it happens. You can't just consciously try and stop doing it. This is a part of your very thought process. And so we arrive at a point where the liberal people in charge know that there's a problem. They have one tool to solve the problem and are afraid to step out of that because that has been explicitly carved out as being a realm of bigotry or racism or something like this. And yet they've got to deal with the fact that in Leicester, for instance, earlier this year, there's a huge riot between Hindus and Muslims.
Yeah.
Can you imagine being an English person in Leicester on that day? Like the Muslims and the Hindus are rioting and fighting.
Yeah.
I don't know what this is about. I don't even understand the languages they're using to communicate.
Yeah.
But this is what the liberal world order can't help but build because it can't recognize the differences.